I am Sergey, and I am here to tell you the story of St. Petersburg in the 1990s. A city of frozen rivers, shadowed alleys, and men who lived and died by their own rules. This is the truth you won't find in newspapers, in TV reports, or in glossy magazines. I will tell you about the streets ruled by Vitya Sever, a man who rose from nothing to control the city's ports, warehouses, and secret networks. I will tell you about betrayals, blood spilled in the snow, and the endless struggle for power that left the city trembling. But this is only the beginning. A new force is rising, smarter, colder, and more ruthless than anything before. A generation that doesn't just use guns, but money, influence, and connections to build an empire. If you want to know how the streets of St. Petersburg really worked, how men like Vitya fought to survive, and how the city changed forever, stay with me. I will tell it all, the victories, the losses, and the shadows behind every deal. Subscribe, follow, and listen closely, because the story of the Bratva doesn't end. It evolves. And I, Sergey, will show you the truth. The city of St. Petersburg in the 1990s was like a wounded beast. Once called Leningrad, it was now stumbling into the new capitalist reality with open scars from the Soviet collapse. The elegant palaces and bridges stood like silent witnesses of another age, but the streets told a different story, one of hunger, crime, and ruthless ambition. Factories that had employed thousands were shutting down, workers were left without salaries, and the black market was thriving. For men who had nothing to lose, the underworld became the only world worth entering. Among those men was Victor, known by his friends as Vitya Sever. He wasn't born into power. He carved his name with fists, blood, and an unbreakable will. By the time he turned 30, he was already feared on the northern side of the city. Vitya had started small, stealing cars, running protection rackets for street kiosks, and smuggling cigarettes through the port. But St. Petersburg was not a city for small men. Whoever wanted to survive had to either rise fast or be buried in the frozen soil of the outskirts. The port was everything. Ships came from Finland, Germany, even from faraway China, and with them came cargo worth fortunes. The customs officers were corrupt, the police were broke, and the city's businessmen were desperate for protection. This was where the gangs came in, and where Vitya began to dream bigger. But he wasn't alone. In the south of the city, another group was rising, led by a man named Sergey Medved Volkov. Unlike Vitya, Medved had spent years in prison and had the tattoos to prove it. His crew was brutal, reckless, and hungry for control. And soon, the streets of St. Petersburg would not be big enough for both of them. On a frozen January evening, Vitya sat with his closest men in a dimly lit cafe near Nevsky Prospect. Cigarette smoke hung in the air, mixing with the smell of vodka and fried potatoes. The city outside was buried in snow, but inside the tension was hot. Across the table sat Leonid, his childhood friend, now his right-hand man. "They're moving in on our docks," Leonid said, his voice low but sharp. "Medved's boys are already shaking down the fins. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." Vitya leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. He had always been calm, too calm for some, but inside his mind was a storm. Losing the port was not an option. It was their lifeline, their empire in the making. "Then we'll remind them whose city this is," Vitya said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but the men around the table felt the weight of his words. A war was coming, and in St. Petersburg, wars weren't fought with rules. 2 nights later, the first blood was spilled. The docks were always alive, even in the bitter cold of January. Cranes creaked, containers rattled, and the fog from the Neva rolled in like a heavy curtain, swallowing sound and light. It was here that Vitya Sever sent a message. A Finnish truck carrying imported electronics was being unloaded under the supervision of Medved's men. 3 of them stood near the gates, Kalashnikovs slung over their shoulders, their faces hidden under thick hats. They thought the night was theirs. They thought wrong. From the shadows, 2 black Volgas rolled up silently, their headlights off. The doors opened, and Vitya's crew stepped out. 6 men, all dressed in dark coats, their eyes hard, their hands steady. Among them was Leonid, gripping a sawed-off shotgun. The air crackled with anticipation. "Who runs this dock?" Leonid's voice boomed as they approached. The guards exchanged glances, their bravado cracking. One of them tried to raise his weapon, but Leonid didn't hesitate. The blast from his shotgun tore through the silence, and the man crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted. Shouts, gunfire, the metallic clang of bullets ricocheting against containers. Vitya didn't fire a single shot. He stood in the middle of it all, calm as a predator, watching his men move with precision. Within minutes, it was over. Two of Medved's men lay dead in the snow, the third crawling away, leaving a trail of blood. "Let him live," Vitya ordered. His voice was cold, deliberate. "He'll carry the message." That message traveled fast. By morning, the entire underworld of St. Petersburg knew that the docks now belonged to Vitya Sever. But victory came at a price. Everyone understood what this meant. Medved wouldn't let such a humiliation go unanswered. And he didn't. The retaliation came brutally. A week later, one of Vitya's kiosks on the south side was burned to the ground, the charred bodies of two young boys, barely out of their teens, found inside. They weren't soldiers, just kids trying to earn a living. But in this war, no one was innocent. When Vitya saw the bodies, his calm facade finally cracked. For the first time, Leonid noticed a fire in his friend's eyes that frightened even him. "They want a war," Vitya whispered, his fists clenched. "Then we'll give them a war." The war for St. Petersburg had begun, and the city felt it in every shadowed alley, every smoky bar, every frightened whisper. Medved struck first. His men weren't subtle. They never were. One night, a black Mercedes pulled up outside a nightclub on Ligovsky Prospect that was under Vitya's protection. Inside, the music was loud, the air thick with perfume and sweat. Outside, the Mercedes doors swung open, and men with automatic weapons stepped out. The gunfire tore through the night like thunder. Windows shattered, screams erupted, and in seconds, the club became a slaughterhouse. 3 of Vitya's soldiers were dead before they could even reach for their guns. The attackers vanished into the darkness before the police arrived, leaving behind bodies and chaos. When Vitya heard the news, he sat in silence for a long time, the cigarette burning down between his fingers. Leonid paced the room like a caged wolf. "We can't keep playing defense," Leonid growled. "They're bleeding us, piece by piece." Vitya finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Then we cut out their heart." The heart of Medved's operation was a warehouse near the Obvodny Canal, a place where weapons and contraband were stored, guarded day and night. Hitting it would mean declaring total war. Vitya knew it. Leonid knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. But there was no turning back. The night they struck was cold, the kind of cold that froze your breath into shards of ice. Vitya led the operation himself, his men moving through the snow like shadows. They carried silencers, knives, Molotov cocktails. There would be no mercy. The first guard never even saw them. A blade across the throat, a body dragged into the dark. The second went down with a muffled gunshot. Then the silence ended. A burst of gunfire shattered the night, and the warehouse exploded into chaos. Vitya moved through the storm like a phantom, his pistol steady, his eyes burning. Flames rose as Molotovs smashed against the walls, smoke billowing into the sky. Medved's men fought back, desperate and brutal, but Vitya's crew was sharper, hungrier. By the time the police sirens echoed in the distance, the warehouse was nothing but a blazing ruin. It was a victory, but it was also a point of no return. The next morning, the city woke up to the headlines. Gang war erupts in St. Petersburg. Politicians spoke of cracking down, police chiefs promised justice, but everyone knew the truth. The streets belonged to men like Vitya and Medved. The city was their chessboard, and the pieces were human lives. The war no longer belonged only to the streets. By spring of 1993, it had seeped into the veins of St. Petersburg itself, into the offices of businessmen, the corridors of the police, and even the smoky halls where politicians drank late into the night. The businessmen were the first to choose sides. Some paid Medved, fearing his brutal reputation. Others turned to Vitya, drawn by his colder, steadier hand. Supermarkets, nightclubs, taxi firms, everyone needed protection, and protection was war. The police were worse. Half of them were on one payroll, half on the other. Investigations went nowhere, evidence disappeared, and raids were always announced before they happened. On the streets, people whispered that St. Petersburg didn't have cops anymore, just two rival armies with badges. One evening, Vitya met with a man named Igor Sokolov, a mid-level politician with ambitions far greater than his office. They met in a private room of a restaurant overlooking the Neva, the river glistening under the pale moonlight. "You control the docks," Igor said, sipping his cognac. "That means you control the city's veins. But veins are useless without a heart. I can give you that heart, permits, contracts, connections. In exchange, you give me security and silence." Vitya studied him. Men like Igor were the new breed, suits instead of leather jackets, boardrooms instead of basements, but their hunger was the same. "You'll get your silence," Vitya replied, "as long as you remember who keeps you alive." From that night, the war changed shape. It was no longer just bullets in the dark. It became money in envelopes, favors whispered in corners, promises sealed with blood. Vitya understood something Medved never did. Power wasn't only taken with a gun. Sometimes, the sharpest blade was a handshake. But Medved didn't play politics. He played war. His men planted bombs under cars, kidnapped businessmen, even executed a police captain who had leaned too close to Vitya's side. The city lived in fear. Every explosion, every funeral, every bribe was another reminder that St. Petersburg was not ruled by law, it was ruled by shadows. Leonid once said it best, sitting across from Vitya in their safe house, his hands trembling from too much vodka. "Brother, we're not fighting for the streets anymore. We're fighting for the soul of this city. And souls are hard to keep clean." Vitya didn't answer. He just stared out the window, the glow of the city reflecting in his eyes. Deep down, he knew Leonid was right. But he also knew something else. There was no turning back. Not for him. Not for any of them. The first cracks appeared quietly, almost invisibly, like frost spreading across a window. For months, Vitya had trusted his men with his life. They had bled together, killed together, buried bodies in the frozen earth together. But in war, loyalty was the most fragile currency. It was Pavel, one of the younger soldiers, who betrayed them. He wasn't born for the life. They all knew it. Too soft in the eyes, too quick to hesitate when the gun needed to be raised. But he was useful, and Leonid had vouched for him, so Vitya let him stay. What Vitya didn't know was that Pavel had a family, a mother and a younger sister who lived in a crumbling apartment on the outskirts of the city. Medved's men found them. They offered Pavel a choice, his blood or theirs. So one night, while Vitya and Leonid planned their next strike, Medved's men already knew every detail. The warehouse, the time, the route. They were waiting. When the ambush came, it was merciless. Vitya's convoy rolled into a side street near the Obvodny Canal, headlights cutting through the fog. Then the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from the rooftops, grenades slammed into the pavement, glass and steel rained down like shrapnel. Two cars burst into flames instantly, screams cutting through the chaos. Vitya's men fought back, but it was a massacre. Leonid dragged Vitya behind a burning car, blood running down his face from a shrapnel wound. "It's a trap!" Leonid shouted. Vitya's mind was already racing. Someone had given them up. Someone close. They barely escaped, crawling through the smoke, bullets snapping at their heels. By the time they regrouped hours later in a safe flat on Vasilievsky Island, half their men were dead. Vitya sat in silence, his face pale, his knuckles white around his glass of vodka. Across from him, Leonid slammed his fist on the table. "We've been betrayed," Leonid said. "Someone fed them everything, and I'll find out who." When Pavel entered the room later that night, trying to hide his trembling hands, Vitya already knew. He saw it in his eyes, the fear, the shame, the broken soul of a man who had traded loyalty for survival. Vitya stood, walked across the room, and put a hand on Pavel's shoulder. For a moment, there was silence. Then, softly, almost kindly, Vitya spoke. "I don't blame you. They found your weakness. Everyone has one. But weakness in this life, it kills us all." Pavel's eyes filled with tears. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. Leonid raised his gun and pulled the trigger. The sound echoed through the flat, final and cold. Vitya didn't flinch. He simply turned away, staring out the window at the frozen city. St. Petersburg was merciless, and now so was he. The war between Vitya and Medved had consumed St. Petersburg like a plague. Night after night, the city shook with gunfire, car bombs, and corpses left in alleyways. Ordinary people whispered about it on trams, the police turned a blind eye, and the politicians pretended nothing was happening. But everyone knew the streets belonged to them. Vitya's crew was smaller now, but sharper. Every survivor was hardened steel. Leonid was his shadow, scarred but unbroken, moving with the quiet ruthlessness of a man who had nothing left to lose. Medved, on the other hand, had grown arrogant. He thought the city was already his. His men strutted through the clubs, collected protection money like kings, and spread his name with fear. But pride was poison. The final strike was planned for a cold night in December. The Neva River was frozen, the city wrapped in silence under a heavy snowfall. Vitya's men moved like ghosts, black coats blending with the shadows. Their target, Medved's main stronghold, an abandoned factory on the edge of the industrial district. Inside, Medved was celebrating. Music thumped from speakers, bottles of vodka lined the tables, and his soldiers laughed too loudly, too carelessly. They thought they were untouchable. The first explosion shattered that illusion. Fire ripped through the entrance, doors blown off their hinges. Vitya's men stormed in, weapons raised, eyes cold. The factory became a war zone, bullets slicing through smoke, men screaming as they fell, glass and steel crashing all around. Leonid moved like a wolf, cutting down anyone in his path. Vitya advanced slowly, methodically, searching for one man only, Medved. They found each other on the top floor, in the manager's old office overlooking the chaos. The door burst open, and there he was, Medved, massive and furious, a pistol in his hand. "Vitya!" Medved roared, his voice shaking the walls. "You should have stayed in the shadows. Now you'll die in them." Vitya didn't answer. His silence was colder than any insult. The fight was brutal. No elegance, no theatrics, just raw violence. The two men clashed like beasts, smashing into desks, shattering glass, blood spraying across the walls. Medved's fists were like hammers, but Vitya was faster, sharper, his rage burning with quiet focus. A shot rang out. Vitya's shoulder tore open, but he didn't stop. Another blow. Medved staggered, blood in his mouth. Finally, Vitya drove Medved against the broken window. Snow and smoke swirled around them. "This city isn't yours," Vitya whispered, his breath ragged. "It never was." And with one last push, he sent Medved crashing through the glass. The giant fell into the frozen night, his scream swallowed by the silence of St. Petersburg. He hit the ground with a final, echoing thud. When Vitya stepped outside minutes later, his coat torn and bloodied, the factory was silent. His men had won. The survivors knelt, their eyes on him, not with fear, but with respect. St. Petersburg belonged to Vitya now. But he knew the truth. In this life, victory was only the beginning of the next war. Snow still covered St. Petersburg, the city breathing heavily after the storm of violence. Weeks had passed since Medved's fall, yet the echoes of war still lingered in the air. Burned-out cars, boarded windows, and quiet funerals were the scars left behind. Vitya had won. But victory in this world was not a crown, it was a burden. The first days after the battle, he walked the streets in silence. Shopkeepers nodded with respect, young hustlers lowered their eyes when he passed, and club owners slipped him envelopes without a word. The city recognized its new master. But power was a double-edged blade. Every night, stacks of cash arrived. Every week, new men pledged loyalty. With every handshake, every deal, the weight on Vitya's shoulders grew heavier. Leonid, ever faithful, warned him. "You've killed the wolf," he said, pouring 2 glasses of vodka. "But now you sit in his den. And wolves always come back." Vitya didn't answer. His eyes stared at the glass, his reflection broken in the liquid. Soon, rivals began testing him. Small crews from the outskirts refused to pay. Corrupt cops whispered about reopening investigations. Politicians demanded favors. Vitya dealt with them all, swiftly, ruthlessly. The man who once fought for survival now ruled through fear. But inside, he felt the change. The streets that once seemed alive now felt hollow. The laughter of his youth was gone, replaced by endless meetings, silent enemies, and the sound of a pistol clicking in the dark. One night, standing on the banks of the Neva, Vitya lit a cigarette and looked over the frozen river. The city stretched before him, cold and endless, lights flickering in the distance. He had everything: money, soldiers, respect. Yet the only thing he felt was emptiness. Leonid joined him, his breath fogging in the night air. "You won, Vitya," he said softly. But maybe the price was too high. For a long moment, Vitya said nothing. Then, in a voice low and bitter, he whispered, "No one really wins in this life, Leonid. We just survive until we can't anymore." The cigarette burned down between his fingers. He let it fall into the snow, the ember fading into the dark. St. Petersburg belonged to him. But in the shadows, new wolves were already gathering. It began quietly, like a whisper spreading through the narrow alleys of St. Petersburg. A new crew was moving in, young, reckless, and hungry. They weren't like the old guard who wore leather jackets and carried scars from prison camps. These men wore tailored coats, carried cell phones, and talked about money more than bullets. But when bullets were needed, they didn't hesitate. Their leader was a man named Sergey Orlov. He wasn't a street thug. He was educated, sharp, with connections in banking and foreign trade. While Vitya had fought his way up from the asphalt, Sergey was building an empire from boardrooms, importing cars, laundering money through nightclubs, and reaching into places Vitya could never touch. Europe, the Middle East, even America. Rumors spread fast. Businesses once loyal to Vitya began receiving new offers. Better protection, cleaner money, fewer bodies left in the street. Some took the deals. Some disappeared. Leonid was the first to notice. One night, he slammed a folder onto Vitya's desk. Inside were photos, burned warehouses, businessmen found dead in their cars, crates of weapons offloaded in the docks under Sergey's men. "This isn't just another gang," Leonid said grimly. "This is war waiting to happen. But it won't be like before. They fight with pens as much as guns." Vitya studied the photos in silence. He had bled to rule the city, but he knew the streets were changing. The wolves of the 90s were being replaced by something colder, sharper. A mafia dressed in suits, backed by banks instead of pistols. And he understood the truth. His war wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The shadows of St. Petersburg were stirring again, and this time, they belonged to a new generation. The war is over, for now. Vitya Sever still walks the streets of St. Petersburg, a man both feared and respected. The city bows to him, yet he knows that peace is temporary, that shadows are never truly gone. I have told you the story of men who lived by bullets, deals, and loyalty forged in blood. You've seen the streets frozen under snow, warehouses burning, and lives destroyed in the pursuit of power. This is the truth of the 1990s, the age of the Bratva, the empire of shadows, the world behind closed doors. But remember this, the streets never sleep, and new wolves are always waiting. What you've heard here is only a glimpse. The city, the men, the deals, they continue in silence, in darkness, and in the whispers that haunt every corner. If you want to know the full truth of the Russian underworld, stay with me. I will tell you everything. The victories, the betrayals, the secrets that no one dared to speak aloud. Subscribe, follow, and listen, because the story of the Bratva does not end. It evolves, it moves, and it lives on in the hearts of those who remember. And I, Sergey, will continue to reveal it all to you.